Okay. We're with Joseph Nicholas, and it's November 20th, 2006, 21st. And we're wondering about your recollection of any history that you remember about Passamaquoddies in Canada or native people living in Canada, either Campobello, Grand Manan, St. George, St. Andrews.
Well, in Grand Manan, they used to frequent that and camp it out for several days for the purpose of hunting and fishing, at least more or less fishing than anything else. But St. Andrews, I have pleasant memories of St. Andrews. When I was just a young kid, I rode in a canoe, paddled with an elderly gentleman, paddled to St. Andrews with my grandmother and Dave's mother seated in the middle of a canoe loaded with baskets. And she'd go over there and she'd have an opportunity to sell them at the Algonquin. But even prior to that, and of course we stayed right there. There were Nicholases that lived there, and the Homans. Wallace Nicholas used to have his own camp right on St. Andrews Point, and then of course he had another camp at Latit, and he used that extensively for fishing and drying fish and hunting for porpoise meat, which was quite a delicacy in our time. As a matter of fact, it was such a necessity. That's all we had to eat at times. But St. Andrews brings me good memories of that. In this year's calendar, I have a cousin of mine who will be pictured in this calendar 2011 when it comes out. And it tells you how she lived there and was raised by her foster grandfather, John Nicholas, who lived to be 102. I don't remember the vast houses that Margaret Nicholas remembered on there, but I remember the few houses, the settlements that were there. And I enjoyed being there, camping out, staying overnight, coming back again by canoe. That's about the gist of my pleasant experiences.
Do you remember any stories of people traveling to Canada to pick sweetgrass and fishing and camping over there? Or the stories of going to Campobello and...
Well, they traveled all over and camped in those places you mentioned, Grand Manan, Campobello, sweetgrass harvesting, so forth. I remember some. I'll be 82 in July, and I do remember some. And at this point in time, when you're 82, you have a vague memory sometimes. But I remember a lot of the good times. Grand Manan was often spoken by a lot of the older people as a place where they went and stayed. And later on, they went over there, played baseball, sport, and a lot of the old timers told me that's where great hospitality was. They were treated very well.
Do you remember any stories of old settlements in Canada?
Not in my recollection, but I'm sure that they're finding out many of the settlements consequently because of your surveys and other people that are doing it now. We couldn't do that extensively at that particular time. We didn't have some of the back knowledge and some of the necessary things to go out there and survey and dig and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we just kind of lived, and that's about it, and remembered how we lived.
Did the boundary line ever stop people from going on the other side to fish? Did they?
Not that I know of. Even the boundary line between going shopping or going to St. Andrews was never a problem when we were going back and forth. Now they're talking about passports and so forth, but We never had any trouble. You go there freely. And they kind of thought this was our country, and it was.
Now, Franklin Roosevelt has a house in Campobello. Have you
Yes.
ever heard any stories of tribal people going over and visiting him?
Yeah, many stories, of course, about Thomas Joseph doing a lot of work for Roosevelt, making him his birchbark material, which is displayed in Campobello, and also took him out canoeing. And some of the photo shots of Franklin D. Roosevelt that were featured in the museum that I established shows President Roosevelt paddling a birchbark canoe built by Thomas Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Indians frequented there. Not only Thomas Joseph, but several others. My grandfather traveled extensively. He was a guide. He did a lot of guiding in Canada. And we used to visit his campsite.
Was that Wallace?
No, that was Horace.
Horace.
Yeah,
Horace Nicholas?
Horace.
Mm-hmm.
And he used to have a campsite. He was a registered guide along with Calvin Austin, my brother. And then I used to drive my grandmother out there. I was quite young, just got my license, and drove him out to the camp in St. Stephen's. I'd like to go back to where it was, but someone told me they could take me out there and point out exactly where that camp was.
Right in St. Stephen's?
Yeah, it's off of St. Stephen's, on the river.
Mm-hmm.
That was my first experience in trying to handle a canoe, at least.
Did you ever hear of a guy named Louis Francis? He died around, I think, in the 50s. He was over 100 years old.
Louis Francis?
Yeah. Yeah,
No,
or Louis Nicholas. He was born in St. George. I don't know his nickname.
In St. George. Well, of course, there were several others that were born in the Canadian territory. Margaret Nicholas, of course, was in Back Bay, or what? What's the name of that
Oak
place?
Bay?
Oak Bay, yeah. And she told a lot of stories in the interview by Eddie. And of course, I learned a lot from her too as well. But
Yeah.
my own experiences have been very pleasant. Going across there, enjoying the ride over, and the stories my grandmother would tell and Dave's mother would tell. Some are very informative and very funny. They had a good sense of humor, and I think that's what's being lost, a lot of it with our reservation now, with our tribe, is a sense of humor and be able to work out a good common sense type things.
Do you ever hear a story of when the ice froze across the bay and
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories about Eddie Bassett and Arthur Jacoby venturing over there with a canoe tied, of course. They going from one big flake to the other, snow iceberg. Yeah, I've heard of that.
yeah, walking across the bay?
Walking across the St. Andrews Bay. It's quite that means it was cold.
Yeah.
I remember my nephew, he got on one of these icebergs. He started floating out, and people try to get out there in a canoe and try to rescue him. He'd start dancing, and they would turn around the canoe until he stopped, afraid the ice would break. But he started drifting out. Incidentally, he was the first Passamaquoddy killed in action in World War II, Walter Meader. Yeah.
His mother was Eva?
Our mother was Eva. I have the picture coming up in the calendar of all the Meader children.
Wow.
And I don't remember a lot of their names, but they're all pictured in one. Except Walter, I didn't notice he was there.
Yeah.
Yeah, he built a big house up on top of the hill. where Gene Wayne lives now. And that's where my sister used to live.
Really? Do you remember any stories of people boating across to Deer Island to go shopping?
Oh yeah, especially during the war, when everything was scarce. We used to go over there and trade for things that they don't have. And a lot of times we had to rush over because the Coast Guard was watching us, but the canoes paddled faster than they did, and we made it over line.
How about any Native people in the Canadian Armed Forces? I heard there were quite a few that were in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Oh yeah, Memorial is over there, the name of Polis, Bassett's, Moore. They all served in the Canadian Army in World War I.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the plaques are over there.
Okay, thanks.
Upstairs, Leon.